more Islamic terror suspects arrested in France, a great many now, more banning of Islamic preachers, but a Muslim Brotherhood meeting is planned, I think just this week, with probably 100,000 people attending. Emmanuel Navon is a French-Israeli journalist and activist politician. He joins us from Jerusalem. Welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Now, after this, the terrible shooting that took place, I was quite surprised, frankly, at how many arrests were subsequent to that. The police on 2 or 3 different occasions in France raided homes and arrested, it must be now, what, more than 25, 30 people?
Yes, there have been many arrests in France after the killing in Toulouse, but what is very clear today to the French government is that the murderer in Toulouse about 2 weeks ago was not acting alone. That there are many terrorist cells today in France, inspired and funded by Al-Qaeda and other radical organizations. And there is a very worrying phenomenon in France and in Europe in general of second and third generation immigrants who came mostly from North Africa and whose children and grandchildren have adopted a radical ideology which is imported from the Middle East, especially from Afghanistan and from Iran and also Saudi Arabia. This is a very worrying phenomenon in France today.
Mm. And it's not confined to France. We see this in other parts of Europe, Britain and Scandinavia, where original immigrants, whether they be from North Africa, it's not geographically confined. It can be North Africa or Pakistan or Bangladesh. Their grandparents and parents wanted to be part of the greater society. It's the children and grandchildren who've been radicalized.
That is correct. In Britain, for example, most immigrants come from Pakistan. In Scandinavia, there are many Muslim immigrants from Turkey, and also in Germany. Now, as you said, most Muslim immigrants who came to France, for example, after the Second World War, came to provide workforce to rebuild the destroyed infrastructure of Europe after the war. And of course, they did not come to Europe with a radical Islamic ideology. As a matter of fact, the nationalist movements in Algeria and Tunisia, who fought France in the 50s and 60s, were secular movements. But as I said, because the second and third generations of immigrants, first of all, feel estranged from French and European society, many of them had a hard time getting jobs and were excluded from the workforce. But also, Saudi Arabia has been very active in funding schools and mosques in those countries, providing them with a very radical ideology, and hence this phenomenon today of seeing Muslims in Europe who are the second and third generation of North African Muslims and who dress just like in the Middle East, just like in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the dress code is completely different from the one from North Africa.
Mm. The resistance movements, the movements of dignity in the Arab world, the Muslim world, were generally secular. You mentioned Algeria, the same applied to Tunisia and Morocco. In Egypt, Nasser was very much a secular person. Palestinians, many of their leaders were Greek Orthodox Christians. But Islamism is now dominant. I always find it extraordinary that you will have Muslims from Pakistan who are third-generation British, who dress like someone from Saudi Arabia when they're religious. But they come from South Asia, that they're victims of colonial oppression from Muslims who impose their religion on them.
Absolutely, and this is true of the Muslims. It's true, of course, of the Christians. I mean, all the Christians in the Middle East suffer from the apartheid policy of Arab countries. Just look at the figures of the Christian population in all Arab and Muslim countries in the past 30 years. It keeps decreasing. They all leave the country. The Copts in Egypt are leaving Egypt. The Christian Palestinians leave Bethlehem and Gaza. And of course, the Christians in Lebanon leave the country for countries such as Canada, France, or other parts of the world. And so there's this policy of Muslim radicalism, not only against moderate Muslims, but also against Christians. And indeed, we have this very strange phenomenon of Muslims today who adopt the dress code, the mentality, and the ideology of a different Islam, an Islam which is not the Islam of their parents, but is the Islam of other countries, mostly Iran, but also Saudi Arabia, which is a very radical version of Islam.
Often a fantasy Islam that never existed in the past. Tell us about this meeting of the Muslim Brotherhood in France. We're talking about tens of thousands of people possibly attending.
Yeah, so first of all, the French government has prevented many of those potential speakers from entering the French territory, of course, following the terrible murder in Toulouse 2 weeks ago. But indeed, I think that the very fact that such a conference is taking place in France with quite radical figures, even though, as I said, the French government has been able to bear some of those potential speakers for taking part. It says a lot about the state of Islam today in Europe, which is not an Islam that wants to integrate into European society, but wants to impose its values and ideology on Europe, and considers that whoever is not a Muslim, and of course this includes the European Christians, are kafirs. In other words, people who have to be converted to Islam. And the way to describe it generally in Europe is to do it through demography, not through war the way it was done hundreds of years ago, but simply through demography and through intermarrying. And we see this phenomenon today in many European countries, where in France about 10% of the population is Muslim. There's a lot of intermarriage. It's true also in other countries such as Britain or Scandinavia. And I think this phenomenon is worrying, and Europeans should wake up and decide whether or not they want to accept these immigration that tries to impose its values and culture on Europe, instead of trying to integrate European culture and values, which is what previous waves of immigration in the previous centuries did when they came to Europe.
Well, certainly in Britain, the example I know best, you had this coexistence of Muslim, Hindu and Sikh from South Asia. They came into the country at the same time, and no one apart from a lunatic has any issue with Hindu and Sikh communities. They're not trying to impose their values. If they want even to live separately, that's entirely up to them, but they generally don't. It's not an issue. They're part of British society. Islam is something radically different. Just briefly, how many people will attend this Muslim Brotherhood conference taking place?
Well, we're talking about a few thousands, and it is not going to be a small event.
Right.
But I think mostly the very fact that it is taking place in Europe and not in a Muslim country, in my opinion, is meant to send a very clear message about what these people are intending to do. I mean, we have to ask ourselves, why on earth are they holding this meeting in Europe and not in a Muslim country?
I think that's the central question, isn't it? Thank you so much for your time. I do appreciate it.
Thank you very much.